Hi folks, my name is Lionel with Bison Transport, and I am sitting here today with Bison's CFO, Damiano. Now, we got together just over a year ago for a very popular topic where we did a video, Damiano, called The Trump Effect on Trucking. So that was filmed just weeks prior to President Trump being sworn in, and now we're a year into the presidency. So we wanted to basically regroup, talk about what we had thought might happen in the past, and see where we are at today. Okay, you're so ready to get started?
Yeah. Well, first, Lionel, thank you for inviting me back. As you know, back when we first started talking about, well, you brought up the topic about we should probably, talk about a little bit of what's occurring in the economy, and really what's catalyzed around that is the nomination of Trump and his election, and that was a key topic area back a year hence. And I guess what I'd say is that at that time there was a lot of, I'll call it, uncertainty, and clearly one of the things that we were as a business working through, and we could see it more on, I'll call it from an economic perspective, was the uncertainty as to whether the economy was going to continue to slow down and ultimately result in a recession, or whether there would be catalysts that would actually propel the economy forward. And the question was, or what I posed, because I changed it a little bit because I think Trump is a little bit beside the point. As I said, Trump doesn't trump economics. The real discussion point was what was going to move our economy forward and then ultimately get activity, jobs created and freight moving.
Right.
Well, what we saw was, and by the way, I'll have to be honest here, I had to go and actually look at my video again to remember actually what I said. But what I had talked about was the agenda for any new incoming president, especially for Trump, was about creating jobs and moving the economy forward. The Liberal government actually got elected a year before that on that same platform, was about moving the economy forward. So what did the Liberal government do? They announced a massive infrastructure program, $160 billion over 10 years, participating with the provinces and the municipalities throughout Canada. And also, it's not widely publicized, but actually leveraging private money as well in a public partnership. Trump came on the scene, and I'm going to say the Republican Party, because ultimately, after a long period of time in different types of governments, you have change. And what they obviously saw was a slow, sluggish economy that was both impacting Canada and the US, and also saw the need for some catalyst. And in that vein, they looked at really three things, but two major things. And one was they started talking up the fact that the government had to invest in infrastructure and get the economy going. That was the big kind of headline, other than the other headlines Trump created. I mean, honestly, when you look at the Trump presidency in the last year, you can say that the Oval Office has kind of become I'll say a reality TV show. But when you get beyond that, the major underpinnings of what Trump was doing, and I'll say the Republican controlled Congress was doing, was looking at how to get the economy going. Two major things that they did, I'll say, focus on and actually were able to achieve was significant tax reform. So we're talking about the headline is tax cuts. So what they did was corporate and personal rates in the U.S. have come down fairly significantly. I'd say the U.S. corporate rate, when you look at coupled with various states, for our business has dropped by 14-15%. Wow. So the marginal rate now in the U.S. is going to be quite a bit more competitive, and actually now is lower than the Canadian rate.
So when taxes are reduced like that, what generally happens?
Okay, so the catalyst there, and again, Canada probably can learn from this and probably are studying the effects, is what's happened is it's created confidence. So the confidence that's been created is the tone from the top, but also the policies that are being implemented. So what's happening is now, U.S. corporations, and I'll say even Canadian corporations with U.S. subsidiaries, are now repatriating money and investing in the U.S. economy to create jobs and also to create activity. That is something that the market has anticipated in this upcoming year, and you've seen it in the stock market, but you've also seen it in actual, I guess the big notable for me is the actual, what's leading our growth now is at private company investment. When you look at the corporate sector, the investment has increased several fold, so 10+% growth within that sector, and that's from real investment that's occurring, whether in Alberta, where you're seeing the recovery on the oil and gas side, in Saskatchewan you're seeing recovery as well, in resource sector, potash, as well as the ag side. You're seeing that in terms of continued infrastructure investment that governments are putting to work. You're seeing that in Ontario, where a notable uptick has occurred on the export side. So all that to say is, what does that mean for, I'll say, Bison and our business, and I'll call it transport in general, is that we're seeing, starting, I'll say, the mid to late 2017, we started seeing upticks in freight. Okay, and that upticks in freight translated into, the best examples would be up until, I'll say, Q3 and into Q4, and Q4 is traditionally a busy period, but we seldom would say that we had days that we've sold out our capacity. Well, we had multiple days that occurred in those last, I'll call it, 4 to 6 months. Okay. Also, interesting enough, in the US, when we talk to our, call it, partner carriers, and we talk to other carriers, they were having sold out weeks.
Right.
So definitely confidence that was created, I'll say, from the tone from the top, and policies like, I'll call it, dramatic tax cuts have had a stimulative impact. The next leg of this is continued investment. And continued investment in the US translates, interestingly enough, they've announced an infrastructure package that's getting through the House, which is basically $1.5 trillion, which is interesting because it mirrors by 10 times what the federal government did in Canada in 2016. Okay. And that multiplier effect is going to continue to assist the economy and continue to have that momentum into 2018, likely into 2019. So there isn't a discussion now about a potential recession. The discussion now is more on, are we going to create inflationary pressures in the economy, which means, labor pressures, and as well as capital pressures, and what that means in terms of just policies. Ultimately, end of the day, jobs are being created at I'll call it, a very brisk pace, both in Canada and the US. Job creation the last 6 months have exceeded, well, the last time we saw job creation at this level was pre-2009, so prior to the last recession. We see that continuing into 2018, with some moderation, but ultimately, we're quite bullish, I'll say, here at Bison, as well as what we're seeing from other participants in industries that we're going to see quite a healthy economy.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the summary there. So the objective of our video a year ago wasn't to have you be the modern day Nostradamus. The things that you had seen at a macro level, seem to have come to fruition so far. So definitely good for you with your analysis there. So to summarize all of that, if I'm watching this video and I am a professional driver in Canada and the US, what does that really mean to me? Like, what should my takeaway be for at least today in this show?
Well, I mean, it's always been a constant theme, and it is a constant theme that whether at Bison or other, I'll call it, transport companies, the driver is the most important resource. It is a resource that, I'll say, has grown over time. So the category of jobs in our driving jobs has grown. There's always need for more drivers, and ultimately, I would say, in our business and what we're seeing, I'll say, across the border, is a demand for, I'll call it, over-the-road driving jobs, especially on cross-border, which is interesting because a lot of again, back, if you remember a year hence when we were talking about Trump's effect, we were talking about some of the rhetoric around NAFTA, how impact, I'll call it the America First policy, which would be I guess, would be considered or implied that it really was a protectionist approach. You know, there is some of those underpinnings in what Trump's doing, but ultimately, what is happening in the background is that everyone recognizes trade is good, right? Trade actually enhances activity for all countries that are involved. Specifically, what we're seeing now is demand has risen and it's actually carried the day. So, you know, in the U.S., many policymakers are saying we've expanded our trade actually with Mexico and with Canada. It's benefited the U.S. and they don't necessarily want the administration to do something that actually stems that flow. Now, how that filters out into, call it NAFTA 2.0 or some kind of other type of trade arrangement, I think the underlying objective here is not to staunch trade. So what I would say in terms of what it means for the driver is that we're going to continue to see cross-border trade grow, actually not contract, grow. On the rail side, they've already hit capacity cross-border. So they literally, unless they create more rail track and actually invest more heavily in, I'll call it automation on the rail side, they're hitting capacity.
So I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're going to hear more of it because you're going to see the big rails announce, and I think they are announcing a significant increase in CapEx. And that has to do with rail infrastructure as well as automation in terms of running these trains longer. But back to what does mean for cross-border trucking, what it means is that the cross-border driver is in more demand and will be required to haul more freight, not less freight, over the next year or two. Now, that's definitely an economic, call it reality in terms of when our GDP and our economy is growing, but also structurally, that is, I'll call it the release valve for exporters in terms of being able to meet customer demand, U.S. and Canada, both sides.
So overall, a good news story for drivers that are, and I guess soon,
I'd say,
our next generation.
A good news story for, I'll say, it reflects, the confidence that we have in the Canadian economy, U.S. economy. It reflects, increasing activity, which benefits, I'll say, the transport companies like Bison. But yes, it also will benefit and will require more, not less, driving jobs.
Okay. Just one more question, then we're going to wrap up this segment here. So we've talked about a driver. How about a shipper? When you talk about that the economy is growing, there's lots of consumer confidence, people are spending more money, and we need professional drivers, both in Canada and the U.S. What would that mean for the average shipper? Is that all good news, or is there things that they should maybe be considering?
For shippers, they've always got a delicate balance because ultimately what they need to do is get their product to market, whether it's business to business or business to consumer. So their challenge is always to ensure that they have an efficient supply chain. Within the supply chain, there are constraints. And I'll say shippers are talking to us now, recognizing that the main constraint is access to their customer. Structurally, they do have options in terms of how they get freight to market and partners that they use. But I think one of the, and it's often quoted cross-border trucking. If you look at cross-border trucking, 60% of all freight moves on a truck.
Right.
And then if you take it to even freight being delivered to the end user, whether it's business or consumer, 90% of all that freight is delivered by a truck. So long story short is a shipper is very sensitive to one of their major modes of transportation and the changes that have occurred. We haven't touched on things like e-logs regulation. We haven't touched on other things, but it's to say that shippers are very, I'll say, aware of the changing market dynamic. Okay. And what does that translate into? Ideally, they want to enhance the partnership with somebody like Bison, not call it commoditize that partnership. And what it means is that shippers are dialoguing with us more and more about how we can work together and to ensure, I'll say, consistent supply. So lots of those discussions. It does mean that to get that consistent supply and to ensure that, again, that their business plan is achieved at our end is that, the rates and commitments, do change over time. So they're very interested in what we're doing. They're very interested in how we're growing the business, because that means additional access to supply. And ultimately, from our perspective, is where shippers participate with us, we also benefit, ultimately being able to attract more drivers and also be able to benefit those drivers. So.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, thanks a lot for the summary on where we're at right now and what the next year ahead may look like for our industry. It definitely is an important topic for both shippers and drivers, and then our own Bison team here as well. So for everyone watching, if you do have any comments or observations, or you have your own predictions on what the Trump effect on trucking may be for the second year in his term, please comment below. We'd love to be able to hear your thoughts, and we'll share our comments on your comments as well. Outside of that, thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, and please continue to engage with Bison and sharing your comments, and even share some ideas of what you'd like to see in future videos. And thanks once again, Damiano. Thanks for watching.